Hello, dear friends, guests, and subscribers to my channel, also subscribers to Alexei's channel. This is live stream. We are doing it on both channels. Side note from Privateer Station, this is a recorded stream and translated in English. It took us usually a couple days to get to this point. All right, back to the stream. Discussing today the flow of war. We want to appeal to our viewers to be patient and strong, because it appears that the escalation threshold is right here. We can see it. And we'll be discussing rather basic, understandable topics today of what's happening on the front, what's happening in the Ukrainian politics. And if you have any questions, you are welcome to leave them in a chat. You can scan the QR code next to the bottom of the screen. The one on the left from the Shelest Club, you can leave the question there. The one on the right links to Alexei's School of Thought, School of Communication. And we start with the usual question of the stream. Today's question sounds like this. If the decision about peacekeepers to Ukraine is made, which country is most preferable? Options. Belarus, yes, they are an ally of Russia, but it definitely means that nobody is going to shoot. India, Brazil, any other non-Western country. Third option is a mix of Western and non-Western. For example, Turkey as a NATO member, but also not entirely NATO country, or just mixed several countries. And the last option is just Western countries, and that will be a guarantee of safety. Today, Belarus said that if Ukraine and Russia would agree on peacekeepers, they're not against it. So, Alexei, do you think we are getting to the option of peacekeepers on the front? Alexander, you know I'm skeptical. I think this war has quite some time to go, at least over a year. Personally, I would love it to finish yesterday, but despite of me continuing to push in that direction, we're still not there. And as for peacekeepers, we want peacekeepers from the countries whom we want to repair relations with. And since we have broken, I think, irreparably our relations with the Global South, we should probably focus on Indian, Chinese, maybe Brazilian, Turkish as well could work. These are the countries that can also affect more safety than just Ukraine, because Black Sea, for example, Turkey presence in this situation, because participating in a peacekeeping function between Russia and Ukraine, that's for sure will last at least dozens of years. And this is a good intervention, in a good sense of this word, into the destiny of Ukraine. And our diplomacy with China and India are really pathetic at the moment. So it would bring additional factor to our politics, to additional purpose to repair these relations. So that's where I would pay attention to. If I was in the office, bring China, Brazil, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, Turkey, and of course Arab countries. I would ask some of them. As for observers, you can bring OCSE from Europe, you can bring American observers, Russian observers, that doesn't matter. Because observers in front of international peacekeeping force likely will not be causing any ruckus. And also, again, regarding peacekeepers, it's not all peacekeepers that are bad. Usually it's one or two that are bad apples, and not peacekeepers, the observers. And you can always work with them. You can buy them, you can change them, you can replace them. After the peacekeepers, we may get understanding. After understanding, we may get agreement. And after agreement, we may get economic revival. This is what we absolutely need. And some countries may be indifferent to Ukrainian problem because of the distance, like Malaysia, Indonesia. But if you have peacekeepers on the borders there and the conflict, then you definitely are on the radar, and this conflict is on your radar, and your attention is there, and you have a good chance of building good relations. So this would be an option for Ukraine to be present in the politics of many countries. They will be obvious allies and friends and partners in this case. And behind the peacekeepers, of course, there is economy. And Ukraine has a good chance of taking space at their mental map of citizens and politicians in those countries. Alexei, you indicated a long time, like 10 years. This is a long story. Why do you think Russia needs to agree to peacekeepers in this case? I understand why Ukraine would want it, because that's some security guarantees. But for Russia, they're usually against these things. Well, if we are exploring the peacekeeping scenario, that implies that Russia has already agreed. So that's why we are exploring this rabbit hole. If we're putting a question wider, why Russia does need to agree to peacekeeping force, if the war stops arbitrarily, let's say along the front line, today in 27, in 2032, sometime, it means that neither of the sides prevailed ultimately in this war. Because the front line means that the presence of front line means there are a lot of well-armed men on both sides with a long bill to each other. In this case, since 1945, the world figured out how to use peacekeeping forces. And that force either serves as a barrier or observes, make sure that there is no escalation. So in this case, we imply that Russia failed to occupy Ukraine, and that's so far what they declare for districts and for regions and Crimea. So alongside this border, having peacekeeping force is a good scenario. But even if it'll be just a limited group of observers for thousands of front kilometers, you cannot get by with small mission. You need several dozen people. That's a huge front line. And I would say we need to make sure that observers are present from all those global countries. Okay, so unfortunately, so far, peacekeeping is not on the table. And right before our stream tonight, Zelensky came to the cameras and added more to Ukraine appeal to its citizens to be stronger. Apparently, there's only 60 Russians left in Kupiansk to kick them out and take it back. And as for Pokrovsk, he's saying that there are only 200 to 300 of Russians in there that need to be kicked out. And Ukraine is apparently capable to do that, according to Zelensky. So I want to ask you a question before we dive deeper into the front line. How is that 60 people, 60 men, take half of Kupiansk? Or 200 to 300 out of 170,000. I heard that in Zelensky meeting with Smolyak on Friday. He did mention that Russia has 170,000 on this direction. But in the township itself, in Pokrovsk, it's only 200 to 300, whom it's rather difficult to kick out, and situation is horrible. And you need to drop everything you have to kick them out. What is that war when one person can control like a city district? Alexander, I'll have to give you a 15-minute long answer if you're ready for that. I'll have to go over all nuance. If you're ready, let's go. First, I'm against war. I'm not a proponent of war. This is my logical stance on this. But since we're fighting, let's fight properly. The strategy, or part of the strategy related to our ground action, I'm not taking the overall military supplies, alliances, the higher level strategy and partnerships, long-range missiles, just what's happening on the ground. We've been making mistakes since the front stabilized, and in somebody's far from smart head, and I think it's a prerogative of President's office exclusively, they birthed the thought of holding a territory. This is a fundamental mistake, which cost us a lot, will cost us a lot, and most likely will lead us to some kind of defeat. Not that Russians will take Kiev and Lviv, but overall balance, when tallied up, will be not in our favor. So it might lead, let's call it not a full defeat, but not a success, right? And very bloody result for us. We can observe that in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk now. Why? Because our foe, Russian Federation, have advantage in troops and means on the ground, both humans and armaments. Quantity-wise, they exceed us. Quality-wise, they also exceed us in a lot of districts and a lot of nomenclature. And the moment we give a task to hold the front line to our troops, Russians on the tactical, operative, and strategic levels always know what we will be doing. And surprise is a key factor in modern warfare that can give some success when both sides are generally of the same level. There are wars that are fought by armies of different generations. 2003, when American army invaded Iraq, the army of 5+ level is fighting the army at the 3 level. And that's why this is a blitzkrieg with complete destruction of Iraqi armed forces. When two armies fight with a difference in one generation of army evolution, everything becomes more difficult. And if you take armies of the same generation, same technical level, take Iran-Iraq war, for example, 10 years of the bloodiest operations, over 20 huge-scale campaigns, 12-year-olds storming minefields, using gases, and the front basically was static. So Ukrainian armed forces and Russian armed forces are the armies of the same generation. There is no fundamental gap between them, and that's why there are no brilliant successes on both sides. And we have de facto the bloodiest bloodbath that continues for several years already. And the only factor you can use in this case is surprise. Instead, we are given orders to stand on the front line, and we are ordered to hold it. Russians always know from the commander of the group, battalion commander, detachment commander, they always know strategically what Ukrainians are doing. So we are putting our troops in a maximally uncomfortable position. You can't concoct a more difficult one, from sergeant to the commander of the army. So we look like a steak that they roll on the plate and just picking which side to take a bite from. So one thing is that we're holding this line, and we also have a political order to try to take back the regions that we lost and positions that we lost. And that's how we lost most of volunteers who came in 22 in these dumb counterattacks, attempts to retake small pieces of land previously taken by Russians. And Zelensky was given hundreds of thousands more mobilized, and they wasted them in the same fashion on the front. What should we do instead? We should have changed 3 to 4 things in the army. First, training system. Even if somebody was conscribed by force, preparation, proper training can bring his motivation up. Professionalism can bring his motivation up. And then there are some stories that they're talking when people were bussified, as they call them, drafted by force. They essentially acknowledge that, okay, I'm in the army now, I will not surrender, I'll do my best. And there are stories of success. So that's what we need to do en masse. We also need to have a change of attitude to soldiers in the army. Today they are rightless subhumans who do not have any right to do anything. They just have to follow orders. We need to change that. The infantry fighter, the lowest level warfighter, has to be on top, not at the bottom. He has to have the logic, the principles, the morale, the freedom. Third is put a stop order, cease to resist on the stationary front lines, and make sure that your main order is destruction of enemy's life force. And allow our commanders to leave the districts, leave their positions, and be much more mobile. And use the German tactic developed by Germany, which allowed freedom to commanders, to unit commanders, while fulfilling a bigger order. So basically, you need to hold that brigade level of defense that has, let's say, 3 points. These are 2 points on the front, 15 kilometers deep, and you can maneuver in this area any way you like, instead of holding the front line. Because the war from the Ukrainian side turned into maximum predictable, dumb bloodbath. Russians always know that we will be holding certain trenches or certain positions, and if we lose it, we will throw forces to take it back. If we had technical advantage, especially in UAVs at the beginning, when we had this advantage, if we did not have that, we would have lost it. Problem is that Russians are already copying and scaling, and in some aspects of UAVs, they already have qualitative advantage over us, and we're still doing the same. So during this time, Russian armed forces, Russian army, have reviewed their tactic, their strategy at least 3 times. They have changed even the big strategy twice. They continuously creatively learn from all the operations that happen on the front. And you can see that the commanders of all levels systemically try to understand, read, and predict and learn from levels. And you can see that happening on the front. If previously they were just giving more artillery to support Wagner troops, so those could penetrate, today they actually combine the work of several different types of detachments. They start to isolate townships like Pokrovsk. They isolate logistics. Today they isolated a big city, right? Pokrovsk is a relatively big city. And they use UAVs to close our attempts to provide any support to that area of defense. How do we respond to that? This is a very sad story. We can say that, okay, on the same schema, we lose the flanks, Russians push on the flanks, and then we hold defense in the cities. Yes, we can say that and indicate that Russians have more forces to do that, but even for that, there are ways to call that. I just don't want to voice it out and aloud. Let's not give hints to Russians here. Well, Alexei, we do have some answers, like intelligence special forces. Right. The way we use them is losing some of the Black Hawks in recent operations. And you also have to put additional discount on what we report, what Russians report. Some of the videos show that they're destroying some units in the darkness with drones. It's hard to tell whether, right, it is the soldier they declare they destroyed. You cannot see even whose soldier it is, but okay, if we trust them. We do have detachments whom it takes dozens of years to train. Their weight is equal to their weight in gold, right? And we do what? We throw them to solve the bottlenecks. They're basically saying that Russian diversion troops are creating a bottleneck to supply Pokrovsk. Somebody needs to go there and destroy those couple hundred Russian troops that invaded that logistics corridor. So it implies that our special forces in pistol distance fights clean these Russian intruders up. And as a legend, that sounds okay, right? But Russians that invaded this area are not by themselves. They have 70,000 group supporting them. That if we deploy, let's say, a couple hundred specialists, what will they do at the final stage of the city collapse? Given that this bottleneck can be resolved with long-range drones on both sides. The ones can be controlled from distance, and Russians use drones rather successfully. They basically used both soldiers and drones to destroy us when we try to resupply the township. 200 Russian troops shooting with rifles at the armored vehicles, bring resupplies to the township, they will not do much damage. Drones definitely can. But what I think is happening now is Budanovshchina, it's a term describing the strategy and behavior like what happened in Snake Island. There was only reason to hold it is to hold a naval sector and keep Russians further away from our waters. But if you remember, we lost several legendary figures there. We lost a pilot there who was the person who actually succeeded in removing his detachment from Crimea when Russians occupied that. So there are some names that were lost there. But the story is that when things go bad, somebody brave comes up and says, you know what, we'll go solve it. And then the guys go in Black Hawks or vehicles or somewhere. And as Yuri Butusov wrote, nobody reports about losses. Nobody reports about successes as well, though. And there are other heroic elements of us getting to the nuclear stations and trying to solve other big issues. And even if we abandon all that and say that this is just wartime propaganda. Now, imagine the head of British MI6, let's say, lands with his troops, with the best of his, somewhere near Fallujah, and leads his people to some operation. That brings to memory an old story that I was told back when I was studying. I don't know how true it is, but it takes place in a Kursk battle of the Second World War, when Germans are already breaking through, and the commander of division, some heroic colonel, let's say Ivanov, takes command of his troop and leads them directly into attack himself. And it succeeds, and they take back the positions took previously by Germans. But the next day, they get an order from Supreme Command, Colonel Ivanov, for abandoning the command outpost of division to be demoted to the infantryman, and infantryman Ivanov to be rewarded with the order of a battle red banner. This is how a normal army should work. With a normal army, Budanov would have woken up as an infantryman, but he would have gotten the hero of Ukraine for this heroism. And imagine that none of our special forces died. Imagine that it's Moscow propaganda. And our special forces indeed liberated the corridor, destroyed all Russian invaders, and out of 170,000 Russians, there is only 1,000 left. The moral is still that the head of a strategic organ, the head of the military intelligence of Ukraine, of Ministry of Defense, is commanding a small deployment operation that shows how bad things are in our defense forces, how bad it is with understanding of bigger military picture and order in the office, in the central command, and that everything demoted itself down to the level of PR, not to the strategy. And of course, Budanov, if he is positioning himself as the future leader who wants to politically fight with Zelensky and the rest and needs all these successes, it just highlights that he perhaps is not in the right place, because otherwise it's a catastrophe. Even if de facto they just by this action, without even going into details, how many losses did they incur, how successful they were, the fact that the head of military intel is commanding a small tactical operation on the front. This is a huge issue. Alexei, do you think that perhaps just dump Budanov in this fashion, and in a week or two they will lose Pokrovsk and they'll point fingers and say Budanov has lost? No. Alexander, in this case, Budanov is going to be presented as savior. It'll be generals who lost this township, or he presented himself as a savior, whoever made this decision. But this has all relation to personal PR, to some PR technology, and its pervasive nature in the Ukrainian leadership. It has nothing to do with military strategy. All right, but the fact is that 60 men are terrorizing the whole township. No, there are not 60 men. It's our media telling us there are 60 men, but I believe there's a lot more people on the Russian side that are already infiltrating that township. And as some of the officers already report in the social, they're saying, I'm not even going to comment how bad things are. And Mariana Bezugla is also indicating that there are significant issues with the type of orders given in the city and the real situation on the ground. But I understand this is probably a part of a bigger campaign that, hey, listen, we're still successful, we can still fight Russians, give us more missiles, give us more munitions, to indicate it to our partners to send us more armaments. And I think our partners would respect us more if we were actually telling the truth. Because Ukraine does have real successes. Yeah, they're small, they're private, but we can highlight them and they're real. Instead of these weird operations. And when President is telling these smaller stories about Kupiansk and Pokrovsk and supporting these weird operations around them that are breaking all the military laws, that's not the right strategy, I think. We had successful operations we can report about. And unfortunately, currently, we do have a whole layer of military leaders who grew from colonels to generals really fast during this war and who are ready to fulfill political orders by Zelensky government, regardless of their military applicability. And Budanov is indeed following Zelensky's orders in this regard. In my view, this is a developing catastrophe and it will end badly for us. Not that we'll lose Zaporozhye tomorrow, but this style of leadership and these fundamental errors, they mean a lot. Political leadership conducting these tactical and strategic operations in such fashion on the front, that leads us to catastrophe. There'll be parts of the front that will collapse and Russians will break through eventually. So in some case, remember we talked a year ago about how will it look like? It is collapsing. In some sense, you can already say this front is already collapsing because these are the operations we see they're undertaking to try to save it. And they can't even describe it properly. There is also an information war that's happening, and Zelensky government is completely failing in the information warfare with Russia. They're delegating this war to TikTok bloggers and some journalists, but actually information warfare is the top layer of war. Cognitive warfare trumps everything else. Today they're not doing it at all. Especially since I left office, I have not seen anybody picking up this banner. They do not understand how to present this operation. All they needed to say is that military intel specialists deployed their best to just hold the corridor, to let our wounded get out and to get more supplies in. So they should have put an accent on humanitarian side of this operation. And Budanov himself, who was supposedly there in camo and with a branch up his butt to save his face. So this should be presented that this was a humanitarian operation to rescue wounded, to allow supplies. And the relatives of the soldiers currently in the township already reading the news that we have now, as everybody in the township is forgotten. The operation was a failure, nothing is getting out, the bottleneck is holding it, and basically say goodbye to your relatives who are holding the township. They're not getting out. And this was a small vignette the Zelensky government could have put to this operation, that humanitarian aspect of allowing the wounded out and providing some support to the troops to enable them to withdraw if needed, and etc. They're failing to acknowledge that, to present it this way. But they never can, they never knew how to. Alexei Nikolaevich, in the same logic, Oresnik, that was supposedly destroyed in Kapustin Yar, half of the Russian panzers that we destroyed, blackout in Zhukovsk, or next to Zhukovsk, or near Zhukovsk airfield in Russia. And I saw these messages. Pro-Zelensky media were sending hundreds of drones, some missiles, and watch, there is blackout in Russia. President said he delivered. This is how that PR campaign looks like in the Ukrainian media sphere. Look, Alexander, it is indeed a stable pattern in our society in Ukraine. Failure on the front, growing degree of information, of heated information, social media that the media, pro-presidential media cannot cover, cannot prevent from being leaked. They then come out and declare something heroic happened elsewhere. There's usually some missile story, some long-range missile, some long-range attack that supposedly draws attention from the failure to it. About 1,000 of our troops are locked in Pokrovsk. Some of them refuse to leave. They're air troopers, Marines, qualified, motivated soldiers who refuse to leave the township without an order. And they're honestly holding it and fighting for it. Wait, Alexei, maybe that's a situation that Zelensky office creates so that they would leave without an order. No, Alexander, they will not. If they're proper soldiers, they will not leave without an order. They'll be holding it for as long as they have the capacity to and ammo. So what, speaking of information fight, Syrskyi comes out and says how successful we are to the media. But have you paid attention to their faces? It's not even the funeral faces. You could look at the officers standing around him. They understand that they're taking part in a crazy, mad operation, completely unobtainium or fake. And the commanders of the direction understand that this is going to be a big graveyard and it'll lead to just more deaths and losses of our troops. They can't even make a proper picture, these information fighters of Zelensky's office. That's why I diagnosed them, especially with that story. Remember with the missile in Dnieper when I resigned? I was trying to look at it from a side. I understood that the task that they are trying to solve is above their level of competence. So what do you think? If I was still in the office, how would all that be looking now with the same Pokrovsk and the others? Right? It would be definitely different. But on the ground, it doesn't cancel the results on the ground. The commanders still and soldiers still have to face the same Russian forces. I cannot even imagine how would you whitewash the Basification that is now ravaging Ukraine. I would find ways, Alexander, if I needed to, or at least partially release the pressure. Let's look at why Pokrovsk, why we did not give up Avdiivka, why we're not giving up Pokrovsk, why we're holding these people there. It's pure for PR effect. What is that PR? Oh, that we're holding till the last man under overwhelming enemy. It takes Russians forever to take every yard of our territory. And the pinnacle of the information strategy is two messages. First, Russians are losing millions and hundreds of thousands by getting 1 square kilometer, and it'll take them forever. And second, their economy is going to collapse soon. Just another month, and their economy will surely collapse. So this is two pillars of Ukrainian strategy. And that's why they're holding for every piece of land and retracting and moving soldiers so slowly that they can prop this pillar that Russians are very slow. And they're basically creating a feeling with the opponent, with the international partners, with the internal society in Ukraine, that this strategy works. That whatever they're doing actually works and slows Russians down. But the strategy is a failure strategy. Even with the failed strategy, though, you could still hold a good face with a good information politics around it, a good information specialists, but they're not. They're failing even in that. So you think Zelensky should have allowed the journalists into Pokrovsk? Frankly, there is nowhere to send them. According to the clips and messages from the front, from that area, the duration, the life expectancy of a professional military who knows to look in the sky, who knows how to hide himself, is very limited. Oh no, Alexei, if we figure out a ceasefire, and then, sure, in this case, Alexander, if you want to take over Putin's initiative, remember in May there was a moment when Putin announced a ceasefire, and I made a post that it would be perfect for our office to take initiative over, and when you're being offered a 3-day ceasefire, you can offer a month ceasefire. So yeah, they apparently read my message 3 hours later, and the president's office posted exactly that suggestion. But yeah, if you already agreed with Putin that there'll be a 3-day to withdraw troops, to withdraw wounded, bring journalists to report properly from the front and show the world what actually is happening in Pokrovsk. And same thing could have been done in Zaporozhye, in Kursk district, but they can't. They don't, because they're solving a very important dilemma between defense of Ukraine and their political future. And they're always picking their political future. This is the faulty setting. This is where all their strategies lead to, and they're not ready to sacrifice anything. We're not talking about any victory here, but lowering the volume and successes that Ukraine could have had otherwise, but just trying to figure out ways to show that Russia paid too much of a price for capturing of Ukraine, and they basically taking their own strategy on their own banner. But I want to say 4 messages here. First, faulty strategy implemented in a faulty fashion, and it's also faulty, supported by faulty media, and this is always reactive. This is also the 4th faulty issue. It never takes initiative over Russians. It always follows. And the problem is that, the main problem is that our feedback is broken. The office of president monopolized all the communications, and they're managing them. And generals and heads of all different departments are just complying so vigorously that real numbers fail to reach the top. Real data fails to reach Zelensky's office. And we don't have any figure who would slam a fist on the table and say, how long are we going to make these dumb decisions? And we're still even not fully aware about the loss of territories and exact human life loss. A good example is operative command of our troops, and it starts with planning of operations. It was always bad, and it was horrible at the beginning of this war. Russians, however, unlike us, had a certain level, an operative tactical level of command that we did not. 3 years of this war, even if you put a monkey in the position of the core command of the group of detachments, even the monkey will learn how to conduct operations. And when we created the corps much later, not correctly, and basically we are disallowed our corps to have the experience that they missed initially. And it takes us 1.5 years additional, probably, till our corps will figure out how to fight. Meantime, Russians already have this advantage. And this shows you how well the feedback can change things, how well can it work. I would remind that back in 22, me and Zaluzhny were trying to reach the office of the president and explain how important it is to create the command for corps and divisions. And when were they created in real life? When Katevich started to scream about that. They had to react to him because he was one of the political figures they paid attention to, just like Azov and the others. And that's when they started talking about it, when some of the military returned from the front and highlighted the same problem. Just pay attention. The opinion of their actual military leader and the military advisor was not paid attention to. Whatever we advised was unimportant. Not until there was a political crisis and a risk to their political future. They made this decision. Russia has already changed their strategy 3 times during these 4 years. With these failures on the operative tactical level, with a systemic growth of Russian quantity and quality, the events on the front in the next few months will be speeding up towards catastrophe for us, starting with the failure of two townships, Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, and ending with more Russian breakthroughs near Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Zaporozhye district. And Dnieper will then soon pop on the maps. That's why what I want to say, this is the diagnosis. The words are hanging in the air. We have almost not touched this topic, but there was no reason to talk about that when the front is stationary. And okay, you can talk about another Russian tank that looked like a furry tank or a hedgehog, and we succeeded in figuring out how to destroy it. But when we observe events like Pokrovsk failure, and when military speakers are talking about that, it is a good opportunity to deliver that 20-minute message. And I'm glad we had a chance to go and talk about that today into this rabbit hole, because this is how this chess game is played by Zelensky's office. This is all what I wanted to answer to your first question. So commanders should not be afraid to talk about their losses on the front. The main goal is to preserve your troops. Saving troops is the main goal, because if you save them, you will figure out how to restore the situation. But if you lost everybody, that's another situation. And I'm quoting presidential statement here. And he's also saying as another marker that 50% of aerial bombs are that Russians drop on the front are being dropped on Pokrovsk now, or the intensity of the front fighting to 50%, it's Pokrovsk fighting. The front is stabilized everywhere else. So it feels like somebody is really unqualified who's working with him. Most likely some civilian who's trying to prop him to these statements, who is not really understanding the scale of comparative materials that he's presenting. Listen, on my third day of being an advisor to Zelensky, I told him that you do not understand military and enforcement agencies. They will always be deceiving you to a degree. Right now, they're afraid of you, afraid of Zelensky, and they're coming to his office ass backwards with their pants down. On the other hand, they also understand, and what they're doing that is only to preserve their positions. Meantime, they also know that Zelensky doesn't understand a crap about military activities. So they know they can deceive him all they like, or tell him present things however they want to present. That's why I advised Zelensky early on to have a special committee of, let's say, 9 very seasoned generals and experts who would be able to check on all the statements and decisions made by the Central Command, and not just follow blindly whatever advices are being given to him by his top brass, or push the top brass because they cannot object to the president. And this is what the first grade cadet learns. How do you present truth to your leadership not to get punished? And generals would not be generals if they didn't know how to present things. So they know what works and how it works, and how to present to Zelensky that he would swallow it, and he would not see some papers or wouldn't pay much attention to them, and would pay more attention to other reports. And then he would run to some PR agent who would draft his speech, check on WhatsApp what else to add about Arestovych success, and then suddenly everything somehow works. And it doesn't. So Zelensky is also being deceived by that system that he created. He, of course, developed his understanding of military matters, but it never passed the level when he can make decisions on his own, when he can make his own estimations of what's happening. He's still being influenced by certain people. And such facts like Madiyar commanding certain forces and some other people commanding stormtroops show that Zelensky do not understand and has lack of knowledge of what is doable, what is not doable, starting from the type of operations, ending with who needs to be placed where, and with the media statements that he posts. Nobody even tells him that when president comes out and talks about the characteristics of missiles, the volumes, he is setting himself up. And Zelensky started with that statement. He allowed himself to be pulled to different press conferences and to state a lot of things about certain guilty parties, about certain technical things. Nothing seems to have taught him. He is making statements that he should not be making. What if the technical data that he presents doesn't meet the reality? That means he lied? He lied to whom? To the international society too? Okay, so Pokrovsk, this is the map for right now, what is available. This is mostly objective, I believe. Just looking at that, what are your main conclusions? So Pokrovsk cannot be saved. There's probably a way to deblocade the Mirnograd, the northeastern part of Pokrovsk. And they're throwing some forces that apparently are succeeding. And even Russian side is commenting that near Rovne, near Shakhova, which used to be called Rosa Luxemburg, apparently Ukrainian forces succeeded in counterattacking. So there is some success in counterattacking. And the task is to not allow Russians to create another cauldron here and encircle the troops in the township. All right, so let's clarify that. These are counter-offensive actions. This is not counter-offensive operation. These are private small actions. You cannot hold that area without big breakthroughs, which you don't have right now. All the reserves we had that could have changed things, they're being used in Dobropolye. When special forces of military intelligence are being thrown to clean the corridor, that means that we are out of reserves. And throwing Azov from Syrbianska to Dobropolye shows what usually happens after that. After that, Russian troops are already near Liman. And as Deep State also indicates, they're not too far from this. For a year and a half, Syrbianska forestry was holding, and then suddenly it jumped. Where is Azov now, Alexei? As far as I know, they are fighting in Dobropolye, at least according to the messages we can see. But this is not the main thing. The area that we're losing every week and the amount of soldiers we're losing every week, even the best detachment cannot resolve it without somehow us having 100,000 well-trained reserve that will be used successfully, because our military commanders will grind this 100,000 also in a rather useless way. So situation is dual-sided. You need to separate it in your head. On one hand, there is no complete collapse of the front. It's not just collapsing. There is a big hole and Russian tank columns are passing through. And people who want to play optimism today, they're saying, oh, stop screaming about the collapse. You've been screaming about that since October of 23, that it will be like this. That Arestovych was talking about that and for years and nothing is happening. Pokrovsk is a small township, no big deal. On the other hand, whatever will be already is. The sum of signs and these decisions they're making and the logic of these decisions already indicates the perspectives rather sharply. That we are at the depletion of our reserves that we wasted first in Kursk and Sumy operation that was mad and unnecessary. And then we wasted a lot of troops on Dobropolye, and it all can be summed up with us not giving a centimeter to Russians to slow them down. And population locally already has to vacate the areas close to 40 kilometers to the front. Right now, we should be creating additional fortifications, changing positions for our troops to withdraw, to hold later better. And we would be in a good position generally if we would be logically preparing these fallback positions, providing engineering, so our troops would be falling back to fortified good positions, especially if we use the nature barriers like rivers, forests, hills. We could have spent time and resource for achieving our bigger goals of Russia wasting too many resources in this war. Unfortunately, we're failing even with that. During the storm of the townships of Popasna and Bakhmut, Russians were losing every 10 for our soldiers. And very few armies can withstand such degree of losses. But in every operation, there comes a moment when their losses become 1 to 3. This is the moment when you need to withdraw your troops from Bakhmut and the like, and we always keep missing these moments. Eventually, the losses become 1 for 1, 1 for 2, which is completely the situation that we should be avoiding. And we're losing what now, 13th, 15th township in the flow of this war. We keep losing this moment when we need to withdraw the troops, because it makes sense to hold the township as the fortified area that helps our troops to hold the territory, helps to grind the enemy forces down. But then there comes a time when we need to move our troops away, because the main goal that we are achieving, we should be achieving, is grinding enemy forces down when we are failing to grind them effectively. Now, the losses in Pokrovsk, it's hard to say what exactly they are, but definitely not 1 to 7. And Russians have 170,000 performing this operation. Basically 2 British armies, or an equivalent of the whole French army, fighting near Pokrovsk. That's why we should have left this township a long time ago. But we keep making everything a fort, and then we're paying with the lives of Ukrainian soldiers for that. Who could have brought more success and more results to our country, and perhaps even stay alive at the end of this war? Instead, we're wasting them. And Sasha, when I'm talking about deaths of our soldiers, I am trying to be calm here. I don't want to peddle moral, sentimental, mothers, relatives, and all that. This is not my genre, but if you just mathematically count people and their lives, they're being wrongfully used as a resource in the framework of the strategy that is deployed by the president of Ukraine and his office. This is the core problem. The central thought is that they're failing to provide for the strategy. The strategy is faulty, and the way they provide for this strategy is also faulty. And this is the core of the story. End of this segment.